The end of World War II brought about an immediate sense of stillness, a vacuum left by the cessation of hostilities that would alter the very fabric of Europe. With the capitulation of Germany in May 1945 and the eventual surrender of Japan later that year, the battlefronts that had once stretched across continents now stood silent. But while the sound of gunfire and the roar of tanks faded, the remnants of war, vast, now redundant armies of vehicles, machinery, and infrastructure remained scattered across the continent. Among the most ubiquitous of these remnants were the thousands of military trucks abandoned by both the Axis and Allied forces. Europe, devastated by 6 years of combat, was now faced with the task of rebuilding itself. The war had caused unimaginable destruction, and now, in its aftermath, the immediate challenges were logistical. There was the need to provide basic services, repair infrastructure, and address the needs of millions displaced by the war. But more pressing, perhaps, was the sheer scale of military equipment that had become obsolete overnight. The trucks, from light reconnaissance vehicles to heavy transport lorries, were designed for war and had fulfilled their purpose. Yet now they had no place in the post-war world. By the end of the conflict, millions of military vehicles had been produced and used by both the Allies and the Axis. In Germany alone, over 1.5 million motor vehicles had been built for military purposes between 1939 and 1945, many of which were trucks, ranging from small utility models to massive, multi-ton transport vehicles. The Allies, too, had produced vast quantities of trucks, most notably the United States, whose production of the Deuce and a Half, the 2.5-ton GMC truck, became emblematic of the wartime effort. As the war drew to a close, both sides found themselves in possession of an overwhelming surplus. The immediate aftermath brought with it economic and logistical strains. The cost of maintaining military equipment after the war was staggering, especially as many of the trucks were no longer needed. The need for transportation in a wartime context had drastically diminished, yet the continent was littered with military vehicles, many of which were unsuitable for civilian use. The logistical nightmare was clear. How could Europe, now reduced to a fractured collection of nations trying to recover, absorb the excess of wartime vehicles? At first, the official stance toward the surplus vehicles was ambivalence. For the Allies, particularly the United States, there was little desire to maintain such a vast inventory of vehicles. The war effort had been expensive, and with the focus now shifting to reconstruction and the beginnings of the Cold War, the surplus trucks were seen as an economic burden. The U.S. military quickly moved to offload the excess equipment. In many cases, this meant offering the vehicles to European countries as part of post-war aid packages, such as the Marshall Plan. But for many of the trucks, particularly those in poor condition or no longer useful, the only option was scrapping. This was the fate that awaited most of the thousands of military trucks scattered across Europe. To scrap a vehicle was not only a practical necessity but also a statement of economic priority. In the early years following the war, Europe was far from economically stable. Nations like France, Italy, and the United Kingdom were focused on rebuilding their industrial bases and addressing the crippling shortages of raw materials, which included the metal required for the construction of new civilian infrastructure. The trucks, which had once been symbols of military might, now represented a drain on scarce resources. At the same time, however, the scale of the abandonment was overwhelming. In some places, entire truck parks were left to rust away, vast fields of military vehicles that became a symbol of the war's final remnants. The U.S. Army alone had tens of thousands of vehicles in storage across Europe, from France to Germany. Some of these vehicles, once meticulously maintained, were left in disarray as the army withdrew. In many cases, the trucks were abandoned in vast depots where they sat for months or even years. The fate of these trucks was varied. Some were cannibalized for parts, while others were simply left to rot. For the trucks in worse condition, the situation was grim. Even those that might have had a chance at being refurbished or repurposed faced a complicated future. First, there was the question of whether they could be restored to any functional level. Military trucks, even those designed for long-term durability, often suffered from wear and tear, particularly after years of use in combat. Many were heavily damaged during the war and had seen little maintenance after their last use. The cost of repairing and reconditioning these trucks was often prohibitive for countries with limited resources. Moreover, the lack of civilian demand for such military vehicles in the post-war economy made it clear that many of the trucks would never see civilian use. In Britain, for example, the War Department began to auction off surplus vehicles in the late 1940s. However, the sales often brought in minimal amounts, as few private buyers were interested in purchasing a vehicle that was designed for combat, not civilian life. Those that were bought tended to be cannibalized for parts or repurposed for specialized industrial uses, but this was the exception rather than the rule. In the Soviet Union, the situation was similar. The Red Army had amassed an enormous stockpile of trucks during the war, and by 1945, the need for them had dwindled. The Soviets faced their own logistical challenges in dealing with surplus equipment. As in other European countries, the immediate post-war years saw the disbandment of many military units, and vast quantities of trucks were left to fall into disrepair. Some were simply abandoned in the same manner as in Western Europe, while others were sent to the far reaches of the Soviet Union to be dismantled or buried. The problem of abandoned military vehicles in Europe was compounded by the growing scarcity of essential resources like fuel. In the years following the war, European economies were stretched thin. Fuel shortages were a constant concern, and in many countries, this made it impossible to use the surplus trucks for any purpose. The trucks that were left in depots or on battlefields were often drained of fuel before abandonment, further reducing their value. Even when fuel was available, it was often more practical to use the limited supply for the essential vehicles that were still in use. Some of the trucks, however, found new life in the emerging post-war economy. In certain cases, vehicles that were still functional were repurposed for civilian use. For example, in the United Kingdom, some trucks were adapted to deliver goods or used in the early stages of the country's rebuilding effort. In France, some were repainted and repurposed as municipal vehicles. But these instances were relatively few compared to the overall numbers of vehicles that were scrapped or abandoned. In Germany, the situation was especially dire. The sheer number of vehicles abandoned by both the Wehrmacht and the retreating Allied forces left a legacy of derelict machines that would take decades to fully resolve. Some trucks were taken by civilians for whatever use they could find, but many simply remained on the streets, rotting away in what had once been the heart of Nazi industry. The cost of reclaiming and scrapping these vehicles was staggering, and the process would take years to complete. The waste was undeniable. By the late 1940s, the European landscape was littered with these military remnants. Yet the scale of the effort required to deal with the surplus trucks meant that their fate was still far from settled. Some were left in huge storage depots, others were abandoned in fields, and many were left to the mercy of the elements. This process of neglect and decommissioning, however, was not without its consequences. The trucks, once symbols of wartime might, had now become a monument to the immense scale of wartime production, a reminder of the efforts made during the war, and of the inevitable waste that came after it. The post-war years saw Europe grappling with the aftermath of the conflict in a myriad of ways, but one of the most enduring problems was the fate of surplus military vehicles, particularly the thousands of trucks abandoned across the continent. The initial wave of scrapping and repurposing had been haphazard and incomplete, and by the early 1950s, the scale of the issue remained unresolved. The fate of these trucks was a microcosm of Europe's broader struggles during the rebuilding process, a balance between economic constraints, logistical challenges, and the desire to dispose of the vast remnants of war in a practical way. One of the central factors in the continued abandonment of military trucks was the overwhelming cost of dealing with the surplus. With many countries still facing financial ruin in the wake of the war, the economic burden of managing these vehicles was too great. The trucks had been designed for a purpose, to transport troops, supplies, and artillery, but in the context of peacetime, their utility had dramatically diminished. Despite the potential value of some models for civilian use, the practicality of integrating them into everyday life was minimal. Trucks designed for military engagements were simply too specialized. In countries like the United Kingdom and France, which had borne heavy losses during the war, the economic situation remained fragile for years. Both nations focused on the urgent needs of reconstruction, and most available resources were diverted into rebuilding civilian infrastructure, not salvaging surplus military equipment. In this context, the fate of the thousands of trucks was sealed. The British government, for example, continued to sell off surplus vehicles throughout the late 1940s, but even these efforts were slow and inefficient. The demand for military trucks in a civilian market was minimal. Those that were sold found limited use in the post-war industrial sector, but the vast majority were simply too old and too heavily worn to be viable. Many trucks were kept in vast storage depots, often located in former military bases or along the fringes of cities that had once been occupied by Allied forces. These depots became increasingly overcrowded as more and more vehicles arrived from across Europe. By the end of the 1940s, both the British and the American military had vast stockpiles of vehicles they had no intention of using. The sheer logistical challenge of managing these vehicles, with their often poor condition and limited salvageable parts, was enormous. Even the most robust of the military trucks, the so-called workhorses of the wartime fleet, were not immune to the ravages of time. The United States, which had sent vast quantities of war material to Europe through the Lend-Lease program, found itself with a particular problem when it came to the surplus trucks. The U.S. had spent enormous amounts of money on military vehicles, but the end of hostilities meant there was little to no demand for them in Europe. Faced with an urgent need to demobilize and turn its attention to the growing threat of the Soviet Union, the United States government chose to prioritize its Cold War preparedness over dealing with surplus equipment. Thus, the trucks were abandoned, scrapped, or sold off at deeply discounted prices. The need to dispose of military trucks quickly led to a rash of destruction. In the early 1950s, military scrap yards, known in some areas as Iron Mountain depots, grew increasingly common. These depots became the final resting places for thousands of military vehicles. Their fate was sealed in piles of rusted metal, stripped of usable parts, and broken down for scrap. In many cases, the cost of scrapping was borne by private contractors who had been contracted by governments to deal with the excess. These contractors, often employed by the U.S. military, would take possession of the vehicles and oversee their destruction. The scrap metal was often sent back to the United States, where it was reused in the burgeoning post-war industrial economy. In countries like Germany and Italy, the disposal of surplus military vehicles took on a different form. In the devastated cities of Germany, where the rubble of war still lay heavy in the streets, the immediate priorities were economic recovery and rebuilding a nation that had been left in ruins. The sheer number of vehicles left behind was staggering. Many of these trucks had been used by the Wehrmacht and had survived the last years of the war, but now they found themselves without any useful purpose. While some trucks were sold off to civilians for domestic use, many more were simply dismantled, their parts sold or used for other purposes, including the production of new vehicles. But even in these nations, a surprising number of military vehicles found new life in ways that had not been anticipated. As Europe began to stabilize in the late 1940s and early 1950s, some of the surplus trucks were repurposed for civilian purposes. These vehicles, however, were not the ones sitting in depots. Rather, they were the trucks that had been scavenged or taken by civilians from the wreckage of military camps. In some cases, these vehicles were adapted for use as heavy transport, as industrial lorries, or even as makeshift farm vehicles. In rural areas, a number of these trucks were used to carry produce, supply rural stores, or transport raw materials to rebuilding cities. Though these uses were far from ideal, they were practical solutions to an otherwise hopeless surplus. However, the vast majority of the military trucks languished in depots, either forgotten or waiting for an inevitable, though slow, destruction. For the average European, these trucks became a part of the background, their presence a reminder of a war that had decimated entire generations. The piles of rusty trucks, some still holding memories of battles fought years earlier, represented the massive scale of wartime production. This was a silent monument to the economic and industrial might of the countries involved in the conflict, but it was also a testament to the enormous waste that the war had left behind. As the 1950s drew on, the disposal of military trucks became less of an issue for the average European nation. By then, most of the trucks had either been scrapped, repurposed, or abandoned. The focus of national governments shifted to rebuilding their industrial sectors and addressing the growing tensions of the Cold War. The remnants of the war, in the form of unused vehicles, slowly faded from the national consciousness. But while the trucks themselves were largely gone by the 1960s, the impact of their surplus remained. The steel and other metals that had once been used to build these trucks were now incorporated into new industries, part of the broader push for post-war industrial growth. The truck's transformation from military symbols to scrap metal was symbolic of the broader transformation that Europe underwent during the post-war years. The war had left deep scars on the landscape, and the removal of these vehicles was one part of a larger effort to erase the tangible remnants of the conflict.